the idea of a white ethno-state is an inherently violent idea, but there are people who promote the white ethno-state, but say they are ostensibly nonviolent, and I think that's an idea itself.
Hi there, this is Phil Gurski, President and CEO of Borealis Threat Risk Consulting in Ottawa, Canada, and you're listening to An Intelligent Look at Terrorism, a podcast about, surprise, surprise, terrorism. For today's podcast, I wanted to turn to a topic that is getting a lot of attention, not just in the United States, but somewhat here in Canada as well, in parts of the West. And that topic is right-wing extremism. You know, we've been living in a post-9/11 period now for the better part of 20 years. We just passed the 19th anniversary of 9/11, and it's been all jihad, jihad, jihad all the time when it comes to terrorism. What do you want to do about it? Over the past, I'd say 18 to 24 months, though, you're seeing more voices rise up and say, well, actually, there are more than just jihadis to look at. There's these guys called the far right, and they take a variety of forms. I've pushed back a little bit against this notion that we got to drop the jihadi stuff and pick up the far right. You actually have to do both simultaneously. But acknowledging that my specialization is not on far right extremism, I decided to bring on to the show today a guest. So I'm very delighted to welcome to the podcast Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She's a professor at Burke University in DC in sociology and education. And more importantly, she's just come out with a new book, which is entitled HATE in the Homeland, the New Global Far Right. So Cynthia, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's get rid of the simple questions first. What in the world drove you as a professor of sociology to start looking at the far right?
Well, actually, I'm really an accidental expert on the far right. I never set out to study it. It wasn't one of these stories like you often have on the Islamist extremism side where people were, moved by 9/11 or motivated in some way. I was studying education, and I was studying vocational schools in Germany. I had been a German major in undergrad and had been long fascinated with the structure of the vocational system in Germany and the fact that 2/3 or so of youth go through that pathway instead of an academic pathway. And I was doing a dissertation looking at youth identity and civic education and in construction trade schools. And it turns out, as I arrived for the initial field work back in 1999 or 2000, around there was an upsurge, a resurgent far right set of developments, and teachers in the construction trades, which are at particularly high risk for right-wing extremism, were very concerned about it. So I ended up spending about 18 months ethnographically hanging around these schools where teachers were having workshops run by police, by local law enforcement. They were having meetings. Some of the classrooms that I spent time in, teachers told me they thought about 80% of their students were actively engaged. And you could see that at that time in the shaved heads and the bomber jackets and the combat boots, where there was a very clear aesthetic set of signals and messages that sort of symbols that told people, what ideology, young people represented.
80%? 80% of students?
In some of the classrooms. So this is where, these classrooms were so segmented. So in the scaffold builder classes, there would be classes where you really would see very high participation. It's a high risk occupation in terms of people who are attracted to the far right. In the concrete layers, in those kinds of occupations, there were high numbers of students at that time who were, either sympathetic or actively engaged in youth scenes that were far right extremist, neo-Nazi. And, so I happened to be in a place where there were a lot of young people there and a lot of teachers struggling to deal with it and reach them. And I ended up then writing a second book in those same schools, not, again, really intentionally, but because while I was back on a trip in 2009, I discovered that this aesthetic shift had happened in the far right in Germany during the few years that I had been away, and that those skinheads that I had become so familiar with, those racist skinheads, had basically disappeared and been replaced with a wide variety of mainstream clothing brands that were marketing to the far right with coded messages and iconography and symbols embedded in them. And this had created difficulties for schools, for stadiums, for bars and clubs,
Mm.
who were banning some of the brands. One of the schools I studied, they had to sign a document that said they wouldn't wear any of these brands in the school, for example. And I ended up writing a book called The Extreme Gone Mainstream, which tracked this sort of aesthetic transformation in the mainstreaming of youth style around the far right. And about 3 months, 2 months after I turned that book in 2017, Charlottesville happened. So, I was then thrust into a lot of public conversations that asked me to explain both to the media, to policymakers. I ended up testifying before Congress, what was happening with global white supremacist extremism, what was happening with youth culture, and ended up just becoming more and more a part of those conversations about the radicalization, and not just the mainstreaming, because then Christchurch happened, El Paso
Mhm.
happened,
Right.
Pittsburgh had happened, right? So it was the mainstreaming and normalization of the aesthetics, and then also the escalation and radicalization to violence. And so then over the past 3 years, I ended up I ultimately wrote this book because I felt like one of the things that happens to me is I go into these spaces, and people, like public spaces or testifying or down, you're briefing people or whatever it is. And people tell me, even in the reviews of my books, like, it's so original. Your ideas are so original. I think that's because, it's seen as original. My comments are seen as original because I didn't come at this from a traditional
Right.
terrorism or intelligence background. I come at it from education, from decades spent working around youth and around teachers who were trying to respond to those youth. And so the book that I wrote now is an effort to suggest that we might need to ask a different set of questions if we want to better understand radicalization. And so I can talk about that now, or I can come back to that. I know I've been talking a long time on the answer
No,
to that first question.
this is great. It's in many ways the serendipitousness of your career matches mine. I got into
Yeah.
intelligence purely by accident because I needed a job during the 1980s recession, but we won't go down that pathway.
Right. Yeah.
Cynthia, let's go back to some first principles, though. One thing that
Yeah.
I have been concerned about when we talk about right-wing extremism is the label itself.
Yeah.
Um, as I said earlier, I focus on Islamist extremism, on jihadism. I've written 5 books on the topic. Jihadis are pretty easy to define. They've got
Yeah.
an absolute common core of principles, not surprisingly, based on Islam, or what I call an aberrant interpretation of Islam. I don't get the impression that the word far right extremism or right wing extremism is nearly as neat as it is for the Islamists. Would you happen to agree with that sentiment?
Definitely. And I wish there was a better way to define it. Not only do we struggle with definitions within any one country, we struggle with definitions across countries. And that really prevents us from our ability to see the global and international interconnected kind of nature of some of the issues. So, when I talk about right-wing extremism, or I call it the far right, which is also not a term that, for example, the government will use,
Right.
because that gets really complicated, and
Especially in your
there are
country.
right, right, and there are far right parties, like the State Department, doesn't want to mess around with elected far right parties in other countries. So there are problems with defining it in a vague way, in a way that encompasses so much. So, but I find I always say far right extremism is the best bad term for what we have.
The least
Um,
worst.
yeah, right, and the least worst, right? And so you can, right wing extremism is also not bad, but it right wing extremism in Germany, for example, they distinguish between right wing extremism and right wing radicalism, where right wing extremism are beliefs and acts that are outside the bounds of the Constitution. They
Right.
are
Right.
illegal. And right wing radicalism is something that might be troubling, but is within the spectrum of legal and constitutionally protected behavior.
No,
And
that's
I've,
interesting. Sorry,
yeah,
because of course the German intelligence service, the domestic one, so kind of like the German version of CSIS, where I used to work, is actually the German word. I'm sure you're aware, is the Organization to Protect the Constitution. So the
exactly.
activities that undermine and the Dutch have a very similar way of looking at terrorism. It's activities that undermine the Dutch constitution, trying to change the governing system of the Netherlands. So the Germans have a similar way of looking at it then.
Exactly. And in fact, it's one of the reasons why I think interventions are so important to understand in a cross-national perspective, and why the German the German approach to prevention of extremism is so important, because it is situated within the protection of democracy. And so it becomes everyone's obligation to protect democracy. And so you see interventions in a much wider range of spaces, in theaters, in churches,
Mhm.
in schools. Of course, teachers have a mandate to prevent extremist radicalization and to try to intervene. I mean, it's part of what they're supposed to be doing. And so and of course, that's because of their history, right? I mean, it's a relatively recent,
Right.
within still people's memories of their families' time when there was,
Mhm.
horrible
Of
atrocities,
course.
enacted in the name of right wing extremism. So it makes sense there. But, here I think we have often thought of it as more like some bad cells that could be eradicated, isolated and eradicated, rather than as something like that's more like a public health contagion, um, that needs to be inoculated against. And I think the German approach really is more of that public health approach. It's the to protect the democracy, we have to make sure everyone understands what misinformation or propaganda is, or how radicalization could happen, and why people might be susceptible to it.
It's almost as if the Germans see this kind of more towards subversion than terrorism, because they're trying to subvert the authority of the state, which has some interesting parallels here in Canada. Before the creation of the civilian security service, the old RCMP security service looked at acts of subversion. So, for example, what was happening in Quebec in the 1960s with the FLQ carrying out bombings and killing people, that was looked at as subversion, not
Mhm.
necessarily as terrorism. So we're kind of going off topic here, but I want to
Right.
pursue this. Okay with you, Cynthia?
Yeah.
In your mind, would there be some advantages to viewing this through the lens of a subversive activity versus an activity that we would call terrorist in nature?
I think that I think subversion is part of it. And so when I think about what is the far right, or how do I define the far right, part of it is anti-democratic beliefs and attitudes, which include things like, not protecting minority rights, not
Hmm.
protecting freedom of the speech or freedom of the press, but also dehumanizing beliefs. And
Yeah.
so there are, it's not just subversion itself. Like, subversion is part of it. There can be seditionist and subversion, but then there's also dehumanization that
Right.
comes in many different forms. There's hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, whether that's white supremacy, male supremacy, Christian supremacy, right? These different versions of hierarchies that create, um, you know, more worthy and less worthy people, and then promote
Hmm.
control over them. And then you have the mobilization of violence that comes on the fringe, and that's where the terrorism comes in. And so I think, I see it as there's a spectrum, and the accelerationist or use of violence, the conspirational kind of nature of a lot of this, about believing in a great replacement, let's say on the white supremacist
Right.
side, that there's an orchestrated effort to replace white civilizations with multicultural ones,
Hmm.
and an existential threat, therefore, that has to be acted against heroically and with violence, is not just acceptable but called upon, like in a moral or heroic way.
Right.
That is part of it too. And so that's at the terrorist fringe. But it's, the terrorist fringe comes from and comes out of, uh, you know, uh, extremist beliefs, not all of which are violent. And that's
Right.
where, you get into, um, what's protected and what's not. Is someone allowed to have abhorrent behaviors, but they still fit in? And then sometimes you have ideas that are violent. I think the idea of a white ethno state is an inherently violent idea,
Hmm.
but there are people who promote the white ethno state, or a white ethno state, but say they are ostensibly nonviolent. And I think that's, can an idea itself, when you take something to its logical conclusion, where ethnic minorities will not have the same rights, let's say, within a territory, or where forced deportations have to happen, in order for, or what's called remigration, and the sort of aesthetic, more mainstreaming of the language. Those are inherently kind of violent ideas, but they are not, necessarily fall within the realm of what we would think of as terrorist activity.
Right, but in order to implement the ideas, at some point there has to be either a coercive act or an act of violence to
Right.
get there. People aren't going to sign up for this voluntarily to have
Right.
their rights given away. Someone's going to have to take them from them and to take them from them forcibly. There's so much in there, Cynthia, this that you've
Yeah.
raised that it's hard to know where to go from here. But
Yeah.
but I do want to pick up on one thing very briefly. You talked about, sort of this notion of a Christian form of extremism, and this really fascinates me because,
Yeah.
again, we are in a post 9/11 period. It was all jihadis all the time, and people began to sort of associate Islam writ large with violence and terrorism. There are many people that think, I mean, Ann Coulter, sorry to bring her name up, but
Yeah.
Ann Coulter famously said that not all Muslims are terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslim, kind of thing.
Right.
How do you see this notion of an extreme form of Christianity fitting into this rather nebulous far right scene?
It's a great question. I think, it's really the civilizational notion, I think, that is most important. And so I it's really a Western kind of a Western extremism or a Western civilization, the defense and protection of a Western civilization against, let's say, an Islamic one. And in that sense, the fact, Christianity obviously is very much a part of that Western definition and understanding, but it's not religious necessarily per se. There are forms of Christian extremism that are really religious, but in the general kind of what we're mostly seeing now in this white supremacist extremist fringe and the global great replacement, it is definitely defined in Christian ways as a Western civilization that is Christian and that is threatened by Muslims and Jews, who, in orchestrated ways, are said to be, organizing a replacement of white civilizations with multicultural ones.
Right,
So they are
this cabal of actors that's going to take
right.
everything over and make us through immigration and all kinds of things like that.
Exactly. And so there is it's explicitly anti Semitic and Islamophobic in its nature, but um, often not explicitly Christian in the definition of, in terms of the religion. They frame it as Western, but
Mm,
Western, of course, is Christian, right? So it's
right.
implicit and cultural often rather than religious. Although there are, of course, within the spectrum, I mean, the Ku Klux Klan,
Mhm.
the longer history of white supremacist extremism in this country is decidedly, rooted in Christianity and in Christian justifications. And then the last thing I'll say is that, I mostly here I'm talking about the white supremacist extremist fringe, which has been responsible for most of these acts of terror and plots that have been foiled over the last few years, especially. But there is also the far right includes the militias, the seditionists, the
Yes.
anti-government extremists, which have a much broader range, and also what we call single issue extremists,
Right.
like
Anti-abortionists.
exactly right. And so you have a much broader range of things that often do intersect with explicit religious
Mm,
justifications around Christianity. And those militias are not at all aligned. There are many different. Some of them are calling
right.
for civil war or something. Right. So
Mm,
we've seen that just in the last over the summer, really, this mobilization of disparate militia and then vigilante groups, which are
right.
another thing as well that can enact mass violence, but again doesn't really fall into our category of like politically motivated terror,
Mm,
in terms of people showing up and then spontaneously engaging in violence at a protest. So I think our definitions are, they're wide, they're complicated, and again that's why I use this best bad term, I call it far right, but it is totally unsatisfactory even to me, and
mhm.
I wish we had a cleaner case. But it is not just the white supremacist extremist fringe. That is the term that I use that I think would be comparable to the Islamist
Right.
extremist in terms of that form. But we're facing a broader range of threats, although the majority of them, according to like the START Center's Pierce data set of the far right, the majority is white supremacist extremist in terms of the acts of terror.
Maybe that could be your next book, is coming up with a term that actually covers it.
Yeah.
But you've really painted a very good picture of just how nebulous and diverse this whole thing is. Getting back to our earlier point about the definition, and I found fascinating your discussion on the implicitness of the Christianity. And this made me think maybe this is why you do not see these groups explicitly using verses from either the New Testament or the Old Testament in the same way the jihadis do. I mean, you can't
That's
get
right.
through 2 seconds out of a jihadi propaganda piece of bullshit in which they don't quote the Quran. I mean,
That's right.
it's just the way they do it. Whereas the Christians sort of is very different. So moving on, Cynthia, to your most current work, Dad, which is focusing on the United States.
Yeah.
You, as you mentioned, right-wing extremism, whatever we're going to call it, has a very long history in your country, going back to the Ku Klux Klan. So after the end of the Civil War and the Restoration period, after that, why do you think in your country, and here I am speaking as a Canadian, and I'm not saying we don't have a problem with this, we do, but I can tell you categorically it's nowhere near the same level of danger or threat as it is south of the border. Why do you think the United States has seen this problem develop to the same extent it has? That's a very easy question to answer, probably in what, 1 or 2 minutes?
It is, right. I mean, what you have are, I mean, I will say that the main way that people have tried to answer this question, this is the major question. Why is it happening? How is it happening? And we tend to answer this question from two different ways over the last several years. One is looking top down at the strategies and tactics of organized groups, or what we call the TTPs, right, in terrorism, like what are the tactics, the procedures, the ways that they're sharing information. And there, when you look at things like social media or the online ecosystem, there's a lot of research showing that the way that people are both self-radicalizing online and encountering propaganda at relatively high rates, engaging in kind of toxic what we call echo chambers or filter bubbles, where they're not encountering other ideas, and how that leads to radicalization. Even the recommendation systems that people, they watch one video on YouTube and then are recommended another video. And so that's been documented to lead people down what some people have called a rabbit hole
Right.
of radicalization. So on the one hand, you have the top-down stuff, which is a transformation, a change in the ways that recruitment happens. And so there's been this documented shift away from, not that there's less direct recruitment happening, but it's just superseded by much greater volumes of kind of self-radicalizing encounters with extremist material that leads people down a pathway of believing in an existential threat and a good versus evil and in their chance to make a difference in it. But we also have what we call from the bottom up, or the demand side of extremism. We have changes in the vulnerabilities that lead people to be more susceptible to extremist rhetoric and propaganda, or even conspiracy theories, because the kinds of things that we know to make people more vulnerable, which include isolation, lack of belonging, a desire to make a purpose, some kind of trauma, sometimes, not always, but also anger, a sense of betrayal. And so there's different kinds of emotional impulses that all contribute to a young person in particular, let's say, being vulnerable to a narrative that offers purpose and meaning and heroic engagement and a chance to be provocative and express anger and lash out against a mainstream. And in that sense, the far right, what they have done, especially in the US and but also in Europe and Canada, I think, is position themselves as the counterculture, and they've weaponized youth culture. And so they draw people in with this kind of ability to lash out at snowflakes or the left or the mainstream in ways that are fun, that have game playing and the meme culture and the use of codes and symbols, and that embed ideology in it, so that it's a package that comes more slowly than maybe in the past, when you're really like joining a militia in the woods or the Aryan Brotherhood in a prison gang, right? Where you're kind of in a hardcore already. There are softer ways of entry. And so, what I argue in the book is that we have been approaching this by looking at the top down and the bottom up, and those are important questions. But we also need to be asking where and when people are encountering extremist ideas. And when you look at those questions, when you go to those places, like I did in construction schools for all those years in Germany, you start to understand how encounters with extremist propaganda can happen and where the initial gateways might be. And that offers a whole different lens for thinking about places to intervene. So, it's a complicated answer, but
Right. It's a
hopefully that,
complicated
yeah.
question.
Yes,
um,
right, right.
you raised this whole notion of the conspiracy theorists, which I
Yeah,
find quite fascinating, and I want to ask you, why is it that, and maybe this is not true, maybe this is just simply my interpretation, we seem to be associating today a large section of conspiracy theorists with the far right, and I would have argued that historically that wasn't true. I mean,
yeah.
conspiracy theory has been around since, Adam and Eve. Why is it, do you think, that, and maybe I'm wrong, and if I'm wrong, please
Yeah.
tell me so.
No,
Why
no,
is it
you're
that
not
we,
wrong.
we we see the conspiracy theorists as being part of the far right now, whereas before they were kind of all across? I mean, we have a conspiracy theory amongst Islamist extremists. We have
Yeah,
conspiracy theory amongst Buddhist extremists and Hindu extremists. The whole notion of this love jihad in India, where Muslims are forcibly marrying Hindu girls and converting them to have lots of babies to replace the Hindus.
yeah.
How did it migrate to the far right?
Well, I think we're seeing growth in conspiracy theories across the spectrum. And in fact, one of the things that I think is happening and that will continue to happen in greater depth that makes even my use of the term far right problematic is a breakdown in the spectrum of what actually is far right versus anything else on the spectrum. So, for example, the Christchurch and the El Paso terrorists used ecological and environmental change,
Yes.
climate
Yes.
change, as part of their justification, and
Yeah.
in ways that we talk about as ecofascism or ecoterrorism. You see these kinds of ways in which the cleanness of a spectrum ideologically between left and right is not as clear or clean anymore. And I think something like QAnon or the growing coalition of anti-vaxxers
Yes.
with anti-government people also show the same kind of strange bedfellows that extreme ideas across the fringes, are kind of forming in new ways. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. And certainly the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of that. But what we have seen, and the reason why I think we talk about conspiracy theories so much on the right, is because there's just been an astronomical growth of 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 far right, on every measure we have available, right, from plots foiled to propaganda, paper flyering of white supremacist extremism, and then actual lethality in the numbers of deaths. As you know, in the U.S., white supremacist extremism is currently the greatest threat and has been
Right.
growing. And much of that is based in a growing international global conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement, which
Right.
which unified a European conspiracy theory called Eurabia, which is,
Yep.
Europe will turn into Eurabia, and one in the U.S., which was called White Genocide, and
Mhm.
sort of gave them a common frame that has then motivated acts of mass terror and plots that have been foiled as well. And so I think that's why we see it, but I don't think it is certainly not exclusive to the far right. It's just grown and become visible, and the acts of violence that have been associated with it have been so heinous that they draw a lot of attention. But if we suddenly saw QAnon, which obviously has elements in the right, but also across the spectrum.
Mhm.
There are anti-Semitic aspects of QAnon, but there's nothing particularly far right about it in its origins. It is bizarre and hard to explain to anybody, but it's growing quickly. And the last thing I'll say about that is that, for somebody like me who spent so much time thinking about youth all these years, and I get asked, several times a week by a journalist or a phone call from a parent or, a teacher, a school, how to help youth, how to, advice for parents, advice for teachers on how to help youth who are radicalizing. I got the first phone call from a journalist this week who wanted to know how to help teenagers whose parents are radicalizing.
Oh,
Right.
seriously?
And so, yes, to QAnon. And
Wow.
and so they're doing a piece. It'll be out soon, I'm sure, Teen Vogue, to talk to kids directly, and they're interviewing kids whose parents have radicalized and into QAnon and don't know what to do. And it was a heartbreaking turn, right, to think, how am I supposed to advise a 14 or 15-year-old right now whose parent has gone down that rabbit hole? So, we are seeing, it's not to say that, first of all, that Islamist extremism is not important, because it still is important. It's not to say that youth are not important, but that we're suddenly this summer seeing a growth in middle-aged men showing up in militias, and, parents on Facebook, like, suburban moms like radicalizing into QAnon. And so I think a lot of that can be explained by the pandemic, the additional vulnerabilities that we know lead people in times of tremendous stress and uncertainty and insecurity to either believe in the black and white and good and evil nature of a conspiracy theory, or to really be mobilized and motivated to take action in some way, to feel like they have something that they can do to stop something out there because they can't control the rest of the
Right.
environment around them.
Sense of control. Just for the record, as a slightly older middle-aged person, I'm not joining a militia. But you've raised a very interesting point that I want to pick up on, and it's this notion that there's been a blending and also a widening of some of the parts of the, call it, the political ideological spectrum that is playing host to this. As somebody who worked in security intelligence for as long as I did, and by the way, you sound to me more like a practitioner than an academic. So that
Yeah.
is a compliment for me, by the way. That's not a negative
Good.
thing. um,
Excellent.
what does this mean for the, governments love to classify things. Good
Yeah.
God, we classify up to yin yang. And so when you're working either for law enforcement or security intelligence or whatever, maybe an outreach and the old CVE, counting violent extremism, what do you do with this dog's breakfast grab bag of different selections from society, all kind of migrating to the same point? I mean, how do you deal with that? I mean, you
Yeah.
can't label it, you can't
Yeah.
compartmentalize it. It's all over the map. So
Yeah.
where
I
would you
mean,
go with that?
I think, if my own experience has taught me anything, it's that there is tremendous value in bringing people into conversations who are not have not spent their entire careers as terrorism experts, but because a lot of this isn't motivated by the same kind of traditional understandings of what terrorism is. And so that's not to in any way disregard or disrespect the tremendous work of scholars of terrorism and practitioners of terrorism and our intelligence agents, but also to say we need to have social workers at the table and
Mhm.
therapists at the table and teachers and parents and people like me who spent their time in schools all these years. I think because these are the people who I think will add to the understandings. And I would
Mhm.
say just the fact that I have been so busy. I mean, the reason why I wrote this book so quickly is because I'd given like 50 talks,
Mhm.
since in just in like 2 years, and including lots of not formal talks, but in addition to those talks, lots of meetings with with folks across DC and Europe, in other places, briefings and advisories and just off the record meetings to explain what was happening in youth mainstreaming and youth culture and youth symbols, and what is a meme, right? How do the memes work? How could a meme mobilize violence? Why would we want to look at t-shirt iconography as something that we could understand violence through? And I think you can. And so I think that is an example of something that's pretty easy to do if you just find people who care and want to be there. And I mean, I know you said I sound more like a practitioner. That is to me the ultimate compliment as well. One of the things that also happened to me is I spent 15 years ticking all the boxes in academia
Mhm.
to get promoted to full professor, and then got promoted and felt more unmoored than I'd ever felt in my life, right? Like, now what do I do? I've just been like following the path of the things. And I decided, and I will continue to write peer reviewed pieces, but if I never have to write a peer reviewed article for an academic audience again, that would be the best thing ever. So this book, right? This book is a trade book, and the book is for the public. And I feel like I've now finally earned the right to decide how I write and to whom I write. And to me, there's no more important audience right now than those outside of the traditional academic community. And if I can write and have the opportunity to write and speak to people in the public and in ways that can translate some of the complexity of what's going on uh, into into more digestible
Mhm.
ways of understanding it, then that's a privilege that to spend some portion of my career now getting to do that. Even though, of course, nothing would make me happier than to have this expertise become completely irrelevant again. So that would be really
Well,
nice.
kudos to you. I think, I really, no, seriously, in all honesty, I do admire that. People have often accused me of being anti-academic, which is not at all
Yeah.
true. I have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
problem with papers, the titles of which I don't understand,
Yeah.
to go ahead and read them.
Me
And the fact
too.
that you're writing this for an audience to help implement it. And I really, really enjoyed the point you made about how, what was it? What was it? Hillary Clinton about the whole "it takes a village to do whatever."
Yeah. Right.
It takes a village to deal with this. I mean, yes, you need your law enforcement, security, intelligence when shit's about to blow up. That's what you want them
Yeah.
for, but
Right.
you don't want them there at the very beginning. That's where you have other actors like
Yeah.
like parent groups, like teachers, like social workers, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. Uh,
Yeah.
we need this multi-sectoral approach to this because no one part of it's going to resolve it. So here's
Yeah.
hoping
That's
that
absolutely right. Yeah.
here's
Yeah.
hoping that the work you continue to do is equally as interesting. I'm certainly going to buy a copy of your book. I'm going to
Thank
promote it
you.
on this website as well. And Cynthia, this time has flown. I got a sneaking suspicion I got to bring you back for
I would love to.
for
I'd
part
love to.
two. I think there are a lot of
Yeah.
topics that we just simply sort of scratched the surface on.
Yeah.
You've been a fascinating guest. I do want to thank you for taking the time, and I'm sure I'm going to talk to you again very, very soon.
Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation and grateful for your work and for the opportunity to speak to your audience. So I'm happy to come back anytime.
So that was my conversation with Cynthia Miller-Idriss, a professor from in the United States who's looking at the far right. What did you think? I mean, is this a problem we need to address in different ways than we have historically addressed terrorism in the post 9/11 period? Give me your feedback. You can reach me on Gmail, borealisrescue@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BorealisSaves. You'll also find me on LinkedIn or on Facebook. If you like this content and you want to share it and you want to get more, please go to my website, borealisthreatandrisk.com, hit the subscribe button. You'll get a free daily digest of all the podcasts, all the blogs, etc., to your inbox every morning. I'd love to hear what you think of my conversation with Cynthia, as well as the other podcasts and blogs, maybe some ideas for future ones. I'll talk to you again soon. Until then, stay safe.